Well, good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about paternalism in public health. In contrast to the non-paternalistic tribal healthcare system that we would find to be advantageous to our indigenous people versus the government-based public health system, which is somewhat disadvantageous to tribal peoples. I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, and she can tell you a little bit about herself. And on the left-hand side of the screen, she can tell you about where we're from in New Zealand.
This is where I'm from. This is the area that my tribe is in. This is our river here that's very important to us, and that's our mountain, Kahuranaki, in the background. That's the Tukituki River, and this is our tribal area. So that's where I come from. It's very important, and it's the most important thing to acknowledge when you're introducing yourself. Is about who you are in relation to the people and where you come from.
Thank you. My name is Joseph Stone, and I'm a member of the Anskapi Pukani tribe. We originally came from up north on the reservation here, next to where the Milk River flows into Canada. And I have a piece of property up by Chief Mountain, so that's my mountain there. And the rivers that flow off of there, the Milk River, Cutbank Creek, and them are my rivers. We see that as valuable because in some ways that's the headwaters of the entire Mississippi drainage on this east side. And so I'm glad to be from there. My family's all from around here, involved in agriculture and in the oil fields. I haven't been around for quite a while. I've been in New Zealand for the last 10 years. So when we talk about paternalism, we have to define it. And it's the interference of the state or a government agency or an individual against a person, against their will. And it's often defended or motivated by a claim that the person that's being interfered with is going to be better off. So these are the laws that they pass that they suggest are going to make you feel better and be healthier. And in some cases, the choices that the government or the professional providers make for a person might not be what that person would like to have. This is a system of managing, governing individuals, communities, nations, and tribal nation states. And it looks benevolent on the outside, but it's often condescending or controlling. Well, next we're going to talk about the micro or individual level of healthcare and paternalism, which gives us a sort of a starting point to move to the larger government paternalism. So in healthcare, paternalism occurs when a physician or a provider, such as a psychologist or an allied healthcare professional, makes decisions for a patient without the explicit consent of the patient. So, for example, a doctor might withhold treatment options from someone, assuming that they know better what the best treatment for that person is going to be, and not allow that person to make their own choice. And that would be paternalistic, overly controlling. And sometimes it's done without consent, and sometimes it's done invisibly. So they get the consent of the patient for what they're offering, but they don't tell the patient what the alternatives are, what the options are in their health care. And we have to look then at how does paternalism fit into the bigger picture? And in order to look at how paternalism fits into the bigger picture, we have to talk about public health. Now, public health is the health of the community, the health of the population, and it's the health of a population in whole. So for example, here on the Blackfeet reservation, it would be health of all of the people on the Blackfeet reservation. And paternalism would be if the U.S. government comes in and suggests that a certain treatment or a certain way of doing things would be more appropriate for the Blackfeet people than what we do ourselves. Public health is a science. It's a science of protecting and improving health of the people, of their communities, injury prevention, preventing diseases. It can be small as the local neighborhood, or as large as a tribe, or as large as an entire country, or as we could see in the most recent coronavirus, novel coronavirus infections that spread around the world. It can be worldwide, and there can be varieties of public health worldwide in responses. The Aboriginal communities in Australia responded early on to the public health crisis of the coronavirus by withdrawing the people from the cities, taking them back out to Aboriginal country, and shutting down access. And as you can see here, the Blackfoot people responded to the vaccinations by allowing people to come in here to the reservation and to be vaccinated through our healthcare program, even if they weren't tribal or native themselves. So as I understand, there were long lines of cars waiting for people to get their public health help here. Amber can tell you a bit about public health in New Zealand.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, public health, where I come from, it's similar in a lot of ways. We have a history of colonisation, so we have this kind of background of, what would I call it? The idea of the defective native, that we're all sick and we behave badly and we do the wrong things, and that we need to be protected from ourselves. Now, at home in my country, public health is probably not so paternalistic, I think, is what Joe's been explaining, but there certainly has been a past that has continued into the present. I mean, things like funding models. Describe the funding models as, you know, like throwing corn to chickens. Is that the government will put out some funding for something, and we all rush in and try and grab some for ourselves to try and do something with it, which is a very disempowering way to come at something like that. I mean, if you want to talk equity and partnership, then we are in no way an equal partner when the government is just saying, well, here's our fund, we've got this pot of money. Good afternoon. Here's our funding. We've got somebody, yeah, thank you so much. It's so much easier to yeah. So, you know, the analogy of the government throwing out corn to chickens, or throwing out dollars to native health providers so that we fight over the dollar for what we need to actually be doing for our people. And that's not a good system. That's a system that causes us to fight each other. It's a system that causes us to think of resources as these things that we need to grab for ourselves. And it's a system that's fundamentally disempowering. And it's disempowering because if you think about it, the government's already made these decisions. The government has decided, or some authority, not a community, has decided what the problem is and how much money is going to go towards fixing it. If you were looking at an equitable system, it would be communities deciding for themselves what they need. It would be communities doing their own budget, and then the communities going to the funding authority and say, this is what we need to do, this is how much money we need to do it. And that's a partnership. Oh, good afternoon. Good to see you. Thank you for coming. Come on in. Which is a very different system, but it's unfortunately a rare system. We don't see it. We see much more of that, you know, here's our pot of money, you guys fight for it. You guys show us how much you can align to what the government wants you to do before we're going to give you any money to do it. And this is shaping, that's a colonisation thing happening right there. And if I get back to the idea of the defective native, and I always think of when I was talking to a Māori man and he said, you know, you could remember this thing of being back at school, and there's this famous picture, I don't have a copy of it, but there's this famous picture that's based on another famous picture from I believe it's from the Renaissance, called The Bark of Dante. And it was essentially picturing these poor, starving Polynesian people with rags and ribs sticking out, and a canoe, and what we call a waka, big ocean-going canoe, in very bad shape, and they're pointing to the land, which is apparently Polynesians coming to Aotearoa. And then later on, they talked about Captain Cook, because under the kind of colonising system, there was no history until Captain Cook got there. And then when you see the pictures of Captain Cook landing on our shores, Captain Cook is perfectly dressed, his hair is perfect, he's looking good and healthy, and he's very authoritative. He's standing there with his British authoritarian gaze. And that's a good analogy for the way that we've been thought about, that we're not as competent, we're not authoritative, that we are naive, that we're childlike, that we let our emotions run away with us, that we're bad with money. So you better watch out of giving us any money. Next minute we'll be giving us to our cousins. And so the government has to take care of us because we're just not competent people. Or we're not as competent as the white person. And I spoke quite a bit about that yesterday. And hence we have paternalism in public health, this remaining idea that, sort of spoke about this about yesterday, it's kind of like being on a bus, and there's a bus driver and he's driving the wheel. Now, the government likes to have their hands on the wheel, and they don't like to have their hands off the wheel. In every colonised country I've been to, that's been the story. So who's driving the bus? You know, is it brown hands on the bus, or is it white hands on the bus? And people don't like taking their hands off the steering wheel. They don't like giving up that authority. Oh, we can't give it to the native people. They're going to crash the bus. They're going to go somewhere where they shouldn't be going. And it's often wrapped up in these statistics about how badly we're doing. I've noticed at home that if there's a bit of fraud that's gone on for a Māori fund, it hits the front page of the papers. It's huge. Look, if it's a white provider, you're probably not going to be on the front page. So we have these stories, and these very negative stories that feed into the myth of this incompetent, childlike native who just needs to be protected from themselves. So that's the underpinnings of, I think, not so much public health, but the whole government system. And if you look at, speeches, it's kind of interesting because I did a history project, I looked at speeches from the late 1800s of politicians, and it was very obvious that, if they just spent less money on gambling or festivals, we wouldn't have to worry about them. The idea that our incompetence is such that we do need help, but we only need as much help as to stop us becoming a burden on everyone else, is to stop us becoming a disease reservoir that's going to run out and affect everybody else. So there's some motivations around that. Well, give us some help, but don't give us too much, because we only need so much in order to stop us being a burden. And if you fast forward 130 years, you will get politicians with exactly the same argument, that assistance is weakening. The Victorian notion of the deserving and the undeserving poor. So a single mother who has a lot of kids is not a deserving poor person because it's her fault. Whereas maybe someone who's, how should we say it? Yeah, there's a difference, there's a difference between somebody being a widow and having 6 kids, and someone having left their partner and having 6 children. There's a very strong societal judgment around that. Still, Queen Victoria's been dead a long time, but the colonisation of the thinking around the undeserving poor is still very much as part of our political landscape. You don't deserve that. You made bad choices. you haven't worked hard enough. You should have gone to college, and if you had, you wouldn't be poor and you wouldn't be sick. So we'll take care of you. And we, you know, those are the subtle messages that we still hear. So Joe, before I go off on a big spout about that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Amber. I'm glad to see that you made it. If I was Bruce Springsteen, I've been to a couple Bruce Springsteen concerts, I'd have a meltdown and we'd have to start all over again. Go ahead. So in paternalism and public health, as Amber just explained it, this is the government taking the role of management and decisions for members of the public. And their goal is ostentatiously or at the surface to improve health care, improve the health of the population. There's a lot of political underpinnings to that, which is keep people just at the level where they can't possibly advance themselves. And that's considered creating a healthy environment for people with poverty. It's done through the laws legally, and it can be hard. There can be laws passed that restrict your choices, absolutely restrict your choices. Helmets for motorcycles, seat belts, things like that. And sensible on the surface, but some people might not want to wear a helmet on their motorcycle. And consequently, if they fall off and hit their head, that's kind of their choice. But in the U.S., if you don't, then you're breaking the law and you'll get a big fine. Softer paternalism can be warning signs. You can get a can of soda, and there might be a little passage on the can of soda that says, don't drink this soda because it's got sugar in it. And that's what we call soft paternalism. What differentiates or makes a difference between non-Indigenous public health and the Indigenous public health system that we live in as tribal peoples? Well, our Indigenous public health system, for example, the public health of this reservation, it's an outgrowth of sovereignty, as sovereignty has developed across the years in the U.S. versus occupation and subjugation. So we can just see a trail or a pattern of occupation and subjugation, and then the tribal people becoming more autonomous, leading to more sovereignty, and sort of a struggle between being subjugated, occupied, taken care of, versus having a sovereign right to make our own decisions. And if you look at it across history, if you look at the subjugation and you look at the occupation, the first efforts at any sort of public health intervention in the United States came through, guess who? The War Department. And that was smallpox vaccinations. And they had a few extra dollars, so a little tiny bit of money was spread around doing a little tiny bit of health care for some of the tribal people in some areas of the country, but it was always at the fort, it was always by the military physicians, and it was always, you'll have to do what you're told. In 1949, they sent health care from the War Department to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but the paternalism continued. The Bureau of Indian Affairs continued to be paternalistic with the tiny amounts of funding and resources that they allocated to the tribal people. And then in 1877, the Bureau of Indian Affairs medical service was terminated. So there was nothing at that point. Then we came into the late 1800s, the assimilation period, which is, I'm sure you're all familiar with the assimilation period of tribal people, the colonization and historical trauma that came as a result of these genocidal, I call them genocidal government policies and practices. So in 1887, we saw the General Allotment Act passed. And what the General Allotment Act did was it attempted to convert tribal people in the way in which we lived on our land to a dominant culture or white economically based individual farmer economy, but simultaneously we were given small tracts of our land, tiny amounts, and the rest of it was put up for sale so white folks could come along and buy our property. So that was a period of time when we lost a lot of property. And we also had the boarding school era at that period of time where they took our people and they took them to boarding schools. So I was talking to a friend of mine in South Dakota about this, and he said, he explained to me, he said, when you see a fight in a tribal council members fighting over the care of our people, the well-being of our people here on reservation, but it doesn't make sense. Why would they be arguing? Why don't they just look at the data and make a decision based on the data? And he said, but you've got to understand, if you go back a couple generations, one of these tribal council members' families were part of the Indian police. Another tribal council member's family was one of the families who had their children taken away by those Indian police and sent off to boarding school. And so that rift or that pain in the tribe, that's remained as a part of the system, a part of the system of oppression. So over the generations, then it becomes lateral oppression, and we sometimes remain angry at one another for what doesn't seem like good reasons. Why would you argue over the health care of your people when there's perfect data there to show which direction you might want to choose to go? But if you've got an old heartbreak, then you're arguing over that old heartbreak. It's just underneath the surface. It's like some of these old couples, and they bicker back and forth over something that happened in 1932. You all know people like that. And it happened in our people, but it became a public health issue for us, became an issue of us, the way in which we can interact, focused at the health of our people. I was reading about the boarding school era, and they said that these young people would come back from the boarding school like these young people did, with their hair all cut off, wearing their nice boarding school stuff. And they were effectively rendered in the perception of the people at the tribe when they returned to the boarding school to non-people. They didn't know how to act, they'd forgotten the language, they didn't know the ceremonies, and they just didn't have a connection back with their people. As the gentleman was speaking this morning, out of that crucible of disenfranchisement and pain comes issues that require, health issues that require intervention. So it's not that the tribal people have got behavioral health problems or family problems or paternity problems or maternity problems. It's that the families themselves have been negatively influenced across time through the colonization process, and that's led us to the point where we have a public health crisis. And that public health crisis then is, I think, best addressed, we'll talk more about this in a minute, through wellness and through cultural revitalization as opposed to medical interventions. We did have traditional health practices, such as the ceremonies. They were banned until the mid-20th century. And the Maori themselves also had that issue of banning their traditional cultural ways.
Yep, we did. We had a very, very similar thing happen. We had a very strong assimilation period in the late 1800s. And that was often supported, in our community. But the reason for that is in the hope that the children could survive. When you've we had some of the best growing soils in the world, apparently. People had done tests on them. We had beautiful resources. That's why we were there. And it triggered a kind of greed when people came and saw what we had. And it's a bit wrecked now. Unfortunately, resources have been stripped. But there was a very strong assimilation period. We had what was called native schools, although they weren't, by and large, they weren't boarding schools, where the kids would go, and they went right into the 1900s. So Maori people, even into their as early as, as young as their 70s, will still remember going to these native schools. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do some research with some elders. It was about their experiences of home as children. And the older ones had these very, very clear memories of the native schools. And it was amazing and a bit shocking to me to actually see the emotion that brought up, how they were treated at those schools. And every older person that I talked to who had been through that would suddenly re-experience it as if they were there again, because they'd been keeping it till they were in their 80s and 90s. And they might be on walking frames. There's one elderly lady who was on a walking frame. I actually didn't think she could walk, but she had so much emotion around being, because we were beaten at these schools, so much emotion around being beat. She actually stood up out of her chair and walked to the centre of the room and reenacted for me getting hit with canes. A lot of that was around speaking your own language. And you didn't have to actually speak your language to still get beaten. You only had to say your friend's name, and if it was a native name, and it was overheard that you called your friend by their native name, you'd be beaten if you couldn't speak your own language. So we had a generation of, more than one generation of people who felt that they didn't fit in, they felt ashamed that they couldn't speak their language, they felt ashamed that they didn't have the cultural competency that they wished they had, and they would shrink away from our traditional life because of that shame that they might not have ever told anyone about. So that was our experience with assimilation. We had an act, quite a famous one in our country. It was called the Tohunga Suppression Act. Tohunga is a holy man, a healer. And the Tohunga Suppression Act basically banned those practices. The idea was, it's a classic example of paternalism, the idea was that there were fraudulent, sort of snake oil salespeople going out and taking advantage of naive Maori. And so the thing would be to pass a law to just stop all that. Well, it stopped stuff, but it stopped all our traditional practices. There was still some going on, but it was a major turning point in the fact that our own ability to practice healthcare amongst ourselves was legally removed. It was illegal for us to do our traditional practices to keep ourselves well. And, sure, that act is long gone, but what we lost has been very hard to reclaim. And of course, into a vacuum comes the foreign knowledge system, comes the colonizing ideas, it comes the ideas of the poor defective natives who can't look after themselves, and becomes a system in which we're treated as if we're children. We don't have that level of empowerment. We need the government to make these decisions for us. That thinking's still there.
Then we go through a period of time in our history called a reorganization, termination, and creation of the Indian Health Service. So we had the Snyder Act passed in 21, which led to some federal funding and limited health care. In 26, the Commission Corps of the Public Health Service were assigned to help the tribal peoples around the country. In 32, the Merriam Report was published, and this was a report on the condition of tribal people. And it basically described our political, social, economic condition and the deprivations which we were experiencing as a result of the colonization and subjugation. But it was an important report in that it led to some thinking in in the government that perhaps some changes needed to be made. In 32, we saw Johnson O'Malley Act passed, and that allowed for contracted services. It still allows for some contracted services, and limited tribal autonomy with federal control retained and exerted. So by limited, I mean they gave us the money, but they also gave us project officers who reinforced to us what we could and couldn't do with the funding we received to engage in health care for our people. And we had a period of time called termination and relocation. And there was inadequate health care passed through the BIA. A lot of tribes around the country were terminated. They were given small checks, amounts of money, told that they were no longer Native people to rejoin the mainstream of society, and then their lands and their areas were nationalized or taken by the government and dispersed through sales to non-Native people. During that period of time, there was a process called relocation, where the tribal people were told, if you go to the cities, we'll take care of your health care, we'll take care of your education, you can have a good thing in the cities, and then you can become lactified, you can become whiter than you once were. N. Scott Momaday's wonderful novel, Housemaid of Dawn, that he won a Pulitzer Prize for, is a wonderful description of the relocation. Also, Leslie Silko's book, Ceremony, and both are wonderful descriptions of what happened as a result of relocation. And I always tell people, thank God for relocation, okay? Because relocation is what led to those boys in northern Minneapolis, Belcourt, Russell Means, and Dennis Banks getting together there and getting together with Crow Dogs and Medicine Man. So they began to recapture their Lakotahood in northern Minneapolis, and from there back to the knee, to the occupation, and calling attention then to the troubles of tribal people. If we wouldn't have had relocation, we would not have had that critical mass of spirituality and culture growing in a far distant place from Pine Ridge, and then coming back from Minneapolis to Pine Ridge, and then from there spreading through the country in the form of the American Indian movement. And that is again a reaction of tribal people to the occupation and to the subjugation. In 24, the Transfer Act moved healthcare from the BIA to the Public Health Service through the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And in 1955, the Indian Health Service was established. I spent a lot of years working for the Indian Health Service. And, I want to tell you a little bit about Peter Shine and a little bit down an Aboriginal friend of ours.
Joe's got a good story about the sweat lodge that we used to work. You and the IHS.
Oh, yeah. Well, they're paternalistic.
I think this is a good example.
They would. They used to have these big meetings, and they bring all of us tribal providers and professionals in, and they bring the management of IHS, which was either apples. That's what my friend Richard called them, apples. We were given a presentation at the IHS conference, and Dr. Grimm was head of IHS at the time, and he wasn't wearing his commissioned corps stuff. He's wearing civvies, so he was sitting right in front of us, the audience. And Richard got up and he's looking around him. He said, "Where is that apple Dr. Grimm at?" And I was pulling by the leg. Apples red on the outside, white on the inside. So we would meet with these people, IHS administrators, IHS tribal administrators, IHS, and then those of us who were tribal people working at the hospital. And we would ask to have a department of traditional cultural health care. Oh yeah, we got to have, that'll be great, we'll do all this stuff, and they'd assign us tasks, and we go work on it, and we bring it back, and nothing had happened. Then we have another meeting, nothing would happen. So one day Richard and I said, sitting down, and Richard said, "Oh, let's sue these guys." So we implemented a lawsuit against IHS, and it wasn't very long after that we had a department of traditional medicine established at the Gallup Indian Medical Center. A building built, a hogan put up, sweat lodges brought in, because they didn't want to go to federal court and answer in federal court the question of why they were blocking this from happening, because they would have been forced to do it anyways, and they looked bad. So that's a paternalistic, it's an intervention into paternalism, but it's also the paternalism and the subtle disenfranchisement of us tribal people through these processes of, let's just all get together and do some planning, and then you guys go out and you create a work plan and we'll implement it. Well, they never did. They never implemented a work plan. I mean, I can talk for hours about the IHS, but as Peter Shine, he's a fellow we know, an Aboriginal person in Australia. He worked for the federal government over there in Aboriginal healthcare, and he used to come out to conference. He said, I was always warned by my boss not to rubbish the government when I came to these conferences. And then, of course, he proceeded to rubbish the government, which is okay. So this is Tamaiti.
If mana can be tested, then you may have to prepare with the bed. No one can tell you that you are not important, and that your experience does not matter. And if they do, I challenge them to say it to your face, where they can see your eyes and feel your breath. Kanohi ki te kanohi, tangata ki te tangata, eye to eye. You have to keep the pressure on. Keep reminding people of the things that they would rather forget. We have to constantly remind the Crown that we were here and we're not going away. That we needed to have a proper, a conversation about the stuff that had gone down with our tipuna, our ancestors. I remember when the Crown went around the country to talk about the fiscal envelope. This was the government offering a limit on the settlement of historical grievances before they had even heard any claims. I decided to make a counter offer for the return of our land. My nephew's horse blanket. But when I arrived, this is what I saw. The Crown sitting on the stage looking down at us. We were not eye to eye. We were not on the same level. So what this short-ass two-way do when we being talked down to? He borrowed a ladder. Hey bro, can I borrow your ladder? This is the Honourable Doug Graham listening to my submission. This is Doug Graham taking my blankets. 4 years later, here is the horse blanket hanging in the office of the treaty settlement in Wellington. They had taken my blanket, framed it, hung it on the wall as a piece of artwork. They had my blanket, but they still had the land. So 4 years later, what does a two-way do when someone steals his horse blanket? He sent an invoice. An expensive one too. So it wasn't really because I wanted the money, not at all. I wanted to remind the Crown that until this was resolved. They still had to take to Tuhoi, and we are not going away. Just like this. Or this. This is the Māori language petition, Hannah Jackson, 1972. The Māori landmass, Dan Whina Cooper, 1975. Bastion Point, Takaparapa, Ngāti Pātua, 1978. The Springbok Tour, 1981. The Anti-Nuclear Campaign, 1985. These are some of the political social movements that have shaped the identity of this country. Not just because they had political opposition at that time, but because after that eye-to-eye contact with the realization that the mana of the people is equal to that of any authority. So after 170 years of struggle, of fighting for the mana or Tuhoi, we finally got respect and understanding from the Crown. We got this.
The Crown unreservedly apologises for not having honoured its obligations to Tuhoi under Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and profoundly regrets its failure to appropriately acknowledge and respect Te Mana Motahaki o Tuhoi for many generations.
So that's Tamaiti, he's a Maori activist. And that's the confrontation of autonomy and sovereignty versus governmental authority. And that's one of the things that we face when we're dealing with the paternal aspects of public health. And I wouldn't hesitate to say that these are the type of things that may be required in order to enforce the type of changes that we would like to see happen. Because we are fully capable of managing our own health care within our own system according to our values, beliefs, and practices. So we have a period then of statutory authority and self-determination. In 75, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Act allowed for more contracting, more compacting. In 76, the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act allowed for more funding and resource allocation. Most of the funding goes to reservations. There's a limited amount to urban programs, which is an unfortunate situation because many of our people have become urbanized. As a result of relocation, they've gone to places like LA, like Seattle, like Portland, and they stayed. So they didn't need their own healthcare systems within Portland, Oregon, but they would prefer to have it administered by tribal peoples. So they have NARA, the Native American Rehabilitation Program in Portland, Oregon. They run healthcare and they run substance abuse and mental health there. One of our own tribal members here, Sydney Stone Brown, was manager at NARA for many years, so I can't go into the stories of NARA like she did, but it's an example of urban health care for tribal people, and it's an example of underfunding and paternalism, because you still have the control of the government projected through the funding and through the resource allocation into the tribal programs. But it is an improvement. So we need to look at a couple of examples of paternalism in Indigenous healthcare. Our history in Indigenous healthcare is reflective of this pendulum between neocolonialism and sovereignty, autonomy versus subjugation and occupation. And as this fellow here points out, as Ronald Reagan said, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Okay. In 1995, I went to the IHS Portland Area Indian Health Board strategy planning meeting. And that was in a big fancy hotel in SeaTac. They laid on a big spread for us, some food. And we had 42 tribes represented, tribal council members, and health management from all those tribes. And then we had the Indian Health Service officials. And remember when Tommy Iti showed the crown sitting up on their dais. Well, when you went in a room, the Indian Health Service was sitting up on a platform like that. We were all sitting on the ground around tables. But they wanted to know what the 10 priorities of the tribes would be. For their strategic planning, they were going to submit that to Rockville, Maryland, to the head office. So we worked on it for 2 days. Put these charts on the wall, voted back and forth. People stood up, they talked about the needs of the tribe. When we got done, we defined for them, in order of priority, the 10 priorities of how we wanted the Indian Health Service to administer funding and resource allocation. And this was a group decision by the 42 tribes. Number 1 was behavioral health. Number 2 was wellness and prevention. Following those were the serious disease issues like cancer, like diabetes. But those were the ones that the tribal people defined. So they said, yeah, we're going to go away, we'll work on this white paper, and then we'll gather everybody together and we'll ratify it. Okay. Well, 3 months later, they give us a call. So John Miller and I, he was tribal CEO, we went back to that meeting again, this ratification meeting. The IHS had one of these big screens. They projected their white paper up there. And behavioral health and wellness and prevention were all the way down at the bottom. And I think up at the top might have been heart disease or cancer and whatnot. Well, what that was about the federal government's priorities and about the workers at the head offices, jobs, and what they were actually doing. And so they redid the paper so that they would just do kind of what they'd always been doing. They wouldn't have to make any shifts, and they wouldn't have to do any changes in resource allocation. And they presented this, and then we were supposed to vote on it, ratify it, and they're going to send it to Rockville. But one of the tribal chairwomen stood up. She said, "This is BS. This is not what we wanted. No, 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 no." So they capitulated. And again, we started over. Well, we had the priorities, and we started over with our discussion. We moved the behavioral health back to the top, number 1 priority, moved wellness and prevention back to number 2, reordered everything, and they said, well, they take that away, and they were going to massage it into shape, into the white paper, into the 5-year strategic plan, and they let us know how that went. So a few months later, got an email, and they sent me that white paper, and they sent it all around all the tribes, the same one they'd sent to Washington, D.C. Can anybody guess what it looked like? It was back to their original documented premises. They moved behavioral health down to the bottom, they moved wellness and prevention down to the bottom, and they put in order what the government mandates were and what the IHS officials at the area office wanted to see happen. So I don't know how many thousands and thousands of dollars they spent pulling us together to do this so-called consultation, which wasn't consultation at all. Amber might be able to tell you a little bit about her perspective on consultation.
Oh, consultation. Yes, well, we have ideas and policies around consultation, but what I've noticed is that consultation tends to be whatever the person who's actually running the show wants it to be. So it often looks like, here's this project that we've decided to do, and here is or we're thinking of doing, sometimes I say that, and here is the money we've allocated for it. What do you think? Now, regardless of whether you say yes or no, that's the program you're going to get. That's not proper consultation because there's no partnership involved. And if there is a partnership, it's extremely unequal. So that those with the power keep the power and those without the power don't get any. And just getting back to the systems thing, we had what we call capitation funding. So you had to enroll with a certain health provider and then you get health care, and then the government, I guess, would pay the health provider for your visits. And this is the time that really brought home to me how much our systems can shape what we do, and sometimes how native people can get inadvertently pulled into the system to the point where they forget to do what's right. They forget to do what they should do. And this is a personal example from me. I was enrolled at one health centre. We'd moved house to quite a bit further away. There was actually a Māori provider, was quite close, native provider. And my son woke up, one of my sons woke up one morning and he was obviously quite sick. He was crying and burning with fever and he wouldn't open his eyes. I was a young mum, I didn't quite know what to do, so I picked him up, put him in the car and I drove him straight to the nearest clinic. And I walked in and my son, I'll never forget it, I had him like this and he was about 3 and he was draped over my arms like a piece of spaghetti. And I walked in and said, "Could somebody see my son?" And the receptionist said, "Are you enrolled? Are you enrolled here?" I said, "No." She said, "Sorry, we can't see you." So I said, "Look, I'll sign the forms right now. I'll enroll with you. Could you just see my son?" And there were doctors and nurses and everything in this clinic. She would not let anybody see me. She said, "Well, go to the place you're enrolled at." I said, "Well, it's a lot further away. I've moved house." "That's where you need to go. We cannot see you unless you're enrolled, and you can't enroll just before an appointment." And one of the nurses did kind of take pity on me and came out and put her hand on his head. She said, "Oh, he's burning up, he is very sick." So I put him back in the car, I drove all the way to where I was enrolled. And the doctor there took one look at him and phoned the hospital. We admitted him to hospital. Specialist came to see him and he was straight into surgery. He could have died. Or he actually had a terrible infection in his eye that was going through his body. He could have easily been blind. As it is, he's got some vision loss. And at that moment I thought, how unfair, how could this happen? And I also thought, if I'm ever in that position, I'm not going to turn anybody away. I don't care what our funding is. I don't care what the rules say. If someone comes into a health provider that I'm involved with and they want help, we're going to help them. And years later, fortunately, I was actually in a position, and I said that straight to the board. And I said, right, if somebody comes in through that door, I don't care whether we provide that service or not. We might need to help them find someone who does, but I'm not turning anybody away, no matter what they're asking for. And it was that experience that helped shaped that. But that's the thinking sometimes that creeps in, is that adherence to the system. That we forget to do the right thing.
Thanks, Amber. And I'll second her on that. We don't turn anybody away. Fire Tapu, she's the CEO there. I'm a clinical supervisor, so people show up, and I'm looking at whether or not they're actually qualified to come into the program. And this is my IHS stuff coming through. It's like, no, and I'll go tell her, we probably really shouldn't see that person because, and she says, no, we're going to see them. So we see them.
Yeah, we've got the skills, we're not turning that person away.
That's good.
We invite them on in, we offer them food, we offer them a drink. I don't care whether it's in our budget or not, I'll pay for it out of my own pocket. These people come in, they're needing, they're hurting. Sit them down and give them some food, give them some drink, find out how you can help.
So in '76, I flew down to San Francisco to do consultation with Bush's Armies of Compassion grant-based program for substance abuse treatment. We were supposed to consult around how to create the infrastructure that the grants were going to come out of. So we were talking about all this and all that. And along comes the management of the Armies of Compassion grant care system, and they told us, don't create opportunities for people to ask for grants based around traditional Indian ceremonialism or traditional indigenous practices. Because likely as not, they won't get funded. Because we want this to be a Christianized program. And I was like, San Francisco's nice. I'll see you guys later. And off I went. Because what can you do? You know? They wanted us to rubber stamp the program. They wanted tribal input to a program that they didn't want tribal input to. The Native people came in, they helped us create this program. It's indigenous in nature, and that was not what they wanted. They just wanted our names on the white papers, so it looked like we had done that sort of thing. So that's paternalism. What should happen to eliminate paternalism in public health?
This is Peter. I know Peter as well. I was actually at this conference.
So that's Peter Shine. He was a master of ceremonies. He gave the opening remarks at Closing the Gap conference in Cairns, Australia. And Closing the Gap in Australia is the federal government looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health disparities and wanting them to be non-disparate with respect to white Australians. They don't care if they get better than white Australians as long as they come to parity with white Australians. So if white Australians got a rate of 36% having heart problems and Aboriginals have a rate of 48%, if we can get them to 36%, we've closed the gap and they're better off. Well, you know, why not bring them to the point of 0% of heart problems? That would be more logical. But Peter talked about the history, and we talked a bit about history today because it's important to understand the histories if we're going to confront the current issues. He talked about the histories of Closing the Gap. He talked about the early 1980s when they first started the program. And he brought out some of the white paper that came on and like. And he said, now they've shifted the funding from the federal government here in Australia providing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait. And they've shifted it out to Aboriginal and Torres Strait corporations. But the Aboriginal and Torres Strait corporations have to do exactly what the government was doing. So they put a black face on it, but it's still the paternalistic white Australians' policies and procedures and practices that are forced to be implemented through it. And if you don't do that, you don't get the funding. So Peter says to us, you know, his final comment was, same shit, different toilet. And that's Peter.
Peter's in Australia. Is how Australians talk. Yeah. They're pretty blunt. It's the sort of things that get said at conferences. He's quite funny, Peter.
So we need to develop sovereignty in Indigenous public health. So there's a few things we can do. We've got to establish tribal health priorities. When I was down in California at a joint meeting of IHS, Portland Area Indian Health Board, California Area Indian Health Board, Ed Fox had just been hired as the CEO of the Portland Area Indian Health Board. So he came in and he asked everybody in the room, it's a huge room, there's hundreds of people in there. He said, and tribal leadership from California, from the Portland area. He said, what are the priorities that you want me to set? Again, we're back to priorities. Is it heart disease? Is it cancer? Is it behavioral health? And there was some talk amongst the leadership, the health leadership, the tribal leadership. And then they came back and they told Ed Fox the single most critical thing for health care in the tribal communities is tribal sovereignty and self-governance. We'll deal with heart disease, and we'll deal with cancer, we'll deal with behavioral health. but we must do it on our terms. Of course, the guys in the IHS were probably sitting in the back of the room going, that ain't gonna happen. But that was the message. That was the message of tribal leadership to Ed, and then Ed was to implement that as well as he could. Amber, any thoughts on that?
I did mention, was anyone at my talk yesterday? Good, because I can tell the same story. I had exactly this kind of experience of being tasked with finding out what healthcare services local community needed. But the government funding organisation already had ideas on what those services should be. They looked at some epidemiology and seen high rates of heart, it was a largely Māori community, seen high rates of heart disease and low rates of heart screening and diabetes checks and things like that. So they'd pretty much pre-decided that those were the services that they were going to, they were going to fund more of those services in the community. So they were going to get an extra couple of nurses and a couple of cars and a tank of gas and some maps, and off you'd go, doing some checks. But they had a lot of problem with people not turning up to their checks. So we'll just send out more, send out more. So I went out. So I was tasked with just talking to people about this, about services. And what I discovered was that nobody wanted more heart checks. There was a reason why people weren't going. It wasn't it wasn't a priority for the community. They didn't want extra nurses. What they wanted was help with addictions. That's where they saw the problems from their community that were happening in their communities. They saw that as where it was coming from, and I can well see that. There was a lot of addiction there. And I was talking to, because I interviewed all ages and stages. The oldest person I talked to would have been well into her 90s, and the youngest person I talked to was 13. And so I was asking this 13-year-old girl about services, health services. If there were to be more services funded in your community, what would you want? And she said, well, if my dad didn't beat up my mum, would be a lot better. We'd be healthier. And that was the point. Dad was going out, he's getting drunk, he's coming home, and it was domestic violence in the family. Nobody wanted another heart check. They wanted to stop the family violence. They wanted to stop the addictions. But there was a very narrow thinking that because there were high rates of heart disease, then that's what needed to be targeted. And it was loud and clear from all ages. The older people, they were the ones most in need of heart checks. And they said to me, well, I've lived my life, I'm fine. I don't need more checks. Do something for the young people. Do something for the addictions that are going on. And I tried hard to get the elders to talk about things that the extra services that they might want. I don't know, more bus services, things like that. No, none of them. None of them wanted anything for themselves. They wanted, if there was resources available, they wanted it to go into the young people. So I took that message back. I don't know if it went anywhere because it runs completely against government thinking around funding, and because they do tend to just look at epidemiological maps and decide what it is that people need. But I hope they did get more help in that area. We did get we were shoulder tapped into another program somewhere else to deal with addictions, and we had the support of 8 tribes behind us to provide that, but that area wasn't included in there, but we have actually helped people in that area. So I guess they're not getting what they need. Yeah.
Autonomy. What do the tribal people want? And so we kind of have to do these focus groups, these evaluations where we actually ask our people, what do you want? As Amber said, do you want more surgeons at the hospital cutting you up, or do you want wellness and prevention? Or what do you want? That should become our priority. And as providers, then if we're going to demand this of the government, we have to act it out ourselves. So we must accord to our people the respect, the dignity, and the sovereignty to make their own individual decisions. Good informed consent at medical care, all the options. What do you want to do? Work with them around that. I don't know. I've been in the business for 33 years. I don't know what's good for someone that comes in my office. It doesn't matter how many smart books I've read. They're the people that know what they need. Education and empowerment. Within our management, we have to educate ourselves as to what is best and what is appropriate. And how do we do that? Do we go to the university? Well, yeah, you go there, you pick up your ticket. But then you go to the people. You know? I was down in New Zealand, and they asked me to write a grant on suicide prevention.
Oh, that's right. This is actually, can I just say, this is an important story Joe's going to tell, because it's something.
I was paternalistic.
It's the sort of story people at conferences don't tell, because it was actually a failure. But and so, you know, when you go to conferences, people talk all about their successes, but you learn so much for when people are willing to talk about what didn't work for them and how they got themselves in trouble. And so respect for Joe here, who's willing to talk about how he stuffed up and why. So off you go, Joe. Here you go.
So I got in touch with Clayton Small about Project Hope. He gave me everything. You should just take it and use it in New Zealand. Okay, so the grant was coming due in a couple of weeks. I was madly writing it, going through all of it each year. You know, it's one of those big grants with all kinds of work. I ran into Amber's office and I said, Amber, how do I replicate a jackrabbit dance amongst the people? And she said,
And I said, hang on, wait. This is what you need to do. There's an elders meeting every month down at the local provider. Right? It's once a month. You go down to the elders meeting, you talk to the person organising it, and you get a spot, because they have presentations. They love to hear different things. So I've presented down there. Go down there and you present, you know, your what you're doing to them, and say you want to do a youth suicide intervention project, and you get some ideas, and then go away and then come back to them with their next meeting and show them what you think they've told you, and then get some feedback. And then Joe's answer was, no, look, this grant, this funding is, I've got this deadline, I've got to meet it, I don't have time to go and talk to those people, I've got to get this done. Here's this, Clayton Small did this great program, and it is a good program. And I just want to, you know, I'm just going to change that. And so I said, well, we don't dance like animals. It's just something we don't do. It's not there's a few cultural things around there, but no, we don't. Oh, are you sure there isn't something else you could dance like? No. No, there isn't. It's just not going to work. And then there was another discussion about, there was, I think in Clayton's program, you sit round in a circle and you talk, and if someone gets upset, it's actually an interesting journey for me as well. Someone gets upset, they have people who come and grab them out of the circle and take them away and look after them. And for me, I was thinking, I know that's not going to work, but I couldn't form the thought to say why. I just knew that's not going to work for us. So I rang up a friend of mine, a Māori friend of mine, actually from a different tribe. She's better at translating than I am, and she's just better at putting things into English kind of thinking and words. And so I said, what is it? This is not right. I can't form the thinking that it's not right, but I know that it's not. And she said, well, that's because we don't take anybody out of it. That's actually, to come and take someone away is demeaning for them. It's the circle's responsibility to support someone who's upset, and you're also taking away their autonomy and their agency by removing someone to do it for them, because that person is in their group. They will support that person. You're disrupting the process if you do that. Yes, of course. So I went back and said that to Joe, and he said, no. if we don't take those upset people out, it's going to turn into, and he used a rude word that I won't use here. Okay. So Joe went ahead with his project. It turns out later on that he asked someone else, and they said the same thing as me, and he didn't listen to them either. Yep.
So I wrote the project up. I was really happy with it. Big, thick thing. Took it down to Pa Fred, who was cultural advisor at the place I was working for.
Didn't you? You went up to the hospital first.
You
went up to the hospital.
Oh, I went up to hospital.
Lewis, and so and this is another sort of interesting point. Joe went and consulted, and no shade on these people. I don't mean to be demeaning them at all. But Joe went and consulted with some of the Māori advisors up at the hospital. They said, "Yeah, this looks great. This is really, this is wonderful. We love the Native Hope Project. This will work for our people. You've got our support."
So I took it to Pa Fred. He's a cultural advisor and social worker. I said,
an elder.
This is ready to go, Pa Fred. And read through it, come back about an hour later, he sat down with me and he put his hand on my knee. He said, "Didn't know you were a paternalistic racist, Joe." I said,
"Ouch."
"What?"
Joe got called a racist.
He said, "This is racist. The Maori have nothing to do with this stuff. This is not us." I was like, "Oh, I worked for this. I worked on this for about 60 hours total." Anyways, he said, "But I'll help you with it." So Pa Fred guided me into how to create a process for the Maoris. So Amber and I put it together, and we now have a suicide prevention program for Maori youth and Maori community based around Maori principles and Maori ideas. And when I set my paternalism and my racism aside, humbled myself in front of the elders, and out of that came a good program. So that's what we've got to do. And when we do that, we also have to provide education to our people. What does it mean when you have this disease, and what are the treatment options, and explain those. Because people are not dumb. They may not have read about that stuff, but if you give them an opportunity to think through it, they'll choose what's right for them. Shared decision making. So we've been through the consultation between us and the government. Tom E.T. Amber told you about it. But amongst ourselves in the tribal public health system, we have to consult amongst ourselves with the people and share our decision making with the people. And in the end, their guidance on what they want is how things should go. It's my job to massage what they want into shape so that they get what they want, and at the same time, the government gets a document that looks like I'm doing what they want, which may not actually be the case, but that's a whole nother story. We've got to include community engagement and participation. We have to bring people together, and we have to talk to them. If I want to know what one of the guys on the street in Cutbank needs, I can't ask a physician at the Indians Health Service what they think they need. I got to sit down with him on a chair on Main Street, if he's on Main Street, and I got to talk to him, introduce myself, maybe buy him a cup of coffee or something, and I got to find out from him what he needs. Because that is what I need to do as a tribal professional. What I need to do is do my level best to give him what he thinks he needs. And if I do that, he might take the ball and run with it. People are very creative, they're very smart. You're given an opportunity to take a path they want to go on, put some resources there, you never can tell what happened. Our policies have to be based on our beliefs, our practices, our values. It's really nice to look at some of the values, beliefs, and practices of the dominant culture. They call them best practices. But in many cases, they don't work for us. We developed a small program in Port Angeles, Washington, Heidi Koss and I. It was a fatherhood training program. We developed it for loggers in the community and tribal people on the Lower Elwha Reservation. It all came out of talking to those people and putting that program together. We ran 8 separate settings with that in it. We presented it around the Western United States. And then all of a sudden, the people that we were coming in to do the program with couldn't do the program anymore because they were mandated by the government to only use best practices. And our program wasn't the best practice. Best practices came out of LA. They came out of the Black and Latino communities. It has nothing to do with loggers or Native American people in the Pacific Northwest. But that was what we had to develop and implement around if we wanted to keep doing our program, which was their program. So we have to look at what the wisdom of the tribal people is and let that wisdom be the guiding light. Now, we can borrow the technical stuff from the dominant culture, white culture, but that shouldn't be the lead. That should be the adjunct. We need an ethical framework and guidelines. And these, again, have to come from us. They have to be developed in conversations amongst us. We have generations of ethical practice, generations of it. Even as this arbor here shows, that framework, within that framework is the spirituality. It's the microcosm of everything people need to do and think about in order to be good providers for the people. We have to be able to think in those terms. So I came from the School of Good Works, got a fancy degree, came out for my first job. I was laying into them because I wanted to have licensed providers. And a license, you had to pass the white people's licensure exam. And finally, a guy sat me down. He said, look, these people that you have as an opportunity to hire know more about these tribes than any licensed professional on the face of the planet. They don't have a license, and they ain't going to get one. But if you don't hire them, you're not going to get good health care for the people. So the ethics of it was to put our own people into those positions and support them. Oh, and by the way, they weren't coercive or paternalistic with the local tribal people because they were part of the system. They were helpers, you know. They were not bosses. We got to take a look at this all the time. We've got to talk to the people. We've got to look at where are we failing. You know, if I would have done an honest evaluation of my efforts when I was trying to create the suicide prevention program, suicide intervention program, I'd have stopped. I might have said to myself, this ain't going to work. The tribal people are telling you that. Do something else. But it didn't. You see, I went ahead and followed my own path. I didn't do evaluation and feedback. I just did the Joe Stone program, which went right into the Joe Stone storage cell, which is like on the ground over there. They're around, and I got a lot of stuff in there myself. But to go out and always ask the people, always be talking to the people about what they need. When I was working as a clinician, I kept logbooks of what the tribal people told me were the types of interventions that were helpful for them. Many of those had nothing to do with cognitive behavioral therapy or medication or any of that. They had to do with ceremony. They had to do with community connection. They had to do with family. But I kept those logbooks because that feedback allowed me to design the type of services that they needed to have.
Yeah, I think that just getting back to that youth suicide program, I think it's a good example of how a program made with different people for a different community might sound really good, but not right for your community. And you know, I'm not sure about here, but I know at home the government will often prescribe programs developed outside, and then along comes a funding packet. And then they wonder why people don't really want to do them. Why don't they turn up to them? Why, you know, and then it's the community that gets the blame for not engaging with this program they're providing. But you know, there's been times, yeah, there's that meeting you came to, Joe, where, for example, there were Māori child nursing, child support workers, all sitting there in a traditional, like a longhouse. And we had a woman, and she was a lovely woman, had the best of intentions, but she just didn't see what the problem was with what she was doing. And she'd done this research on middle class people in England and come up with these ways of communicating. So she was there on our lands telling our child health workers how to communicate with families. And you say, well, what would she know? Oh, yeah? You know, what would she know? So with the best heart in the world, wasn't going to go anywhere. But the government said that our people should go along and listen to this because it was going to help us. And that's that, you know, knowledge generated from somewhere else by someone else coming in. Oh, and if I'm, oh no, it's all right, we're running out of time, aren't we?
We have the knowledge, the wisdom, the insight into our needs, the legal right to define healthcare needs and manage healthcare according to tribal priorities. We just need to take steps to sovereign Indigenous healthcare partnership. And by partnership within our communities, with our people, not necessarily with the government. So we're at the time for questions and comments, which I don't know if we got time for, but.
No, yeah, anyway, that was paternalism. It's a bit of a dry subject. It's not as exciting as some of the others. I'm glad some people did come. But I guess, you know, thanks to Joe for that information and just encouraging some more thought around some of the policies and practices.
Okay, thank you.